For 6 months, I watched my son turn into someone I didn't recognize. And the whole time he had no idea I'd already spoken to a lawyer. I'm not a man who talks about his feelings easily. 63 years of living in Northern Ontario will do that to you. You learn to keep things close, work through problems quietly, not make a fuss. My father was the same way, and his father before him. So when things started going wrong in my own home, the home I'd built my retirement around, I didn't say much. I watched, I waited, and I made a phone call that changed everything. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. Not glamorous work, but good work. The kind where you show up every morning knowing that the bridges and buildings you're responsible for won't fall down. I retired at 61 with a solid pension. Some savings I'd been careful about my whole life. And a house in Sudbury that I owned outright. 3 bedrooms, a decent backyard, a garage I'd converted into a workshop. My wife Margaret had died 4 years earlier. Breast cancer, fast and brutal. And after that, the house felt too big for one person. But I stayed. I wasn't ready to leave the place where we'd raised our son together. My son's name is Andrew. He's 34 now. Growing up, he was a good kid. Curious, a little stubborn. The kind of boy who took apart every appliance in the house just to see how it worked. Margaret and I were proud of him. When he got into Ryerson for mechanical engineering, we drove him to Toronto ourselves, helped him move into residence, and tried the whole way back on the 400. He graduated, got a decent job at a manufacturing firm, and a few years later he called me to say he'd met someone. Her name was Jade. I didn't meet her until Christmas that year. But Andrew spoke about her constantly. How smart she was, how driven, how she had plans for everything. I remember thinking that sounded like a lot of plans for a person I hadn't met yet. When I did meet her, she was polite, attentive in the way that feels deliberate. She asked me questions about my career, laughed at the right moments, helped clear the table after dinner. Andrew looked at her like she'd hung the moon. I didn't say anything. I was happy he was happy. They got engaged the following spring. Then, about 8 months before the wedding, Andrew called me with an idea. He and Jade wanted to buy a house. Toronto was impossible. They'd been renting a 2-bedroom in Etobicoke, and even with both their incomes, anything decent in the city was out of reach. They were thinking about moving to Barrie. Good commuting distance, more space, better value. The numbers made sense, but they were short on the down payment. Andrew asked if I would consider selling my Sudbury house and moving in with them. His pitch was careful and rehearsed. The house they were looking at had 4 bedrooms. I'd have my own space. We'd split the costs. It would be good for all of us. He'd have family close by. I wouldn't be alone rattling around in a house too big for one person. And together, we could afford something that none of us could manage separately. He said they wanted me there. That it would feel like a real home. I thought about it for a week. I walked through every room of the Sudbury house. I sat in the workshop where I'd spent hundreds of quiet evenings after Margaret died. Then I called a family lawyer. Not because I was suspicious, just because I was 62 years old and I'd been an engineer long enough to know that even good plans need to be documented properly. The lawyer, a woman named Hoffman, was straightforward with me. She said the cleanest arrangement would be for my contribution to be reflected in the title. I'd be putting in $210,000 from the sale of my house, roughly 40% of the purchase price. She said we could register that as an undivided interest, meaning I'd legally own 40% of the property regardless of what happened down the line. Andrew agreed without any pushback. We signed the paperwork in March. The house closed in May. The first year was fine. Better than fine, actually. Andrew and I had dinner together most nights. I helped with small repairs around the house, nothing I couldn't handle. And I kept myself busy. I drove into Barrie for groceries, joined the woodworking group that met on Thursday evenings, made a few acquaintances. I wasn't lonely. I had my own bedroom, my own bathroom, enough independence to feel like a person and not a guest. But I noticed things. Jade had a way of making suggestions that didn't sound like suggestions. She'd say things like, "It would be nice if we kept the kitchen clear in the mornings," and I'd realize 2 days later that she meant me specifically. Or she'd mentioned that she was thinking of turning the spare room into a home office. And I'd find myself wondering which spare room. And then realizing she meant the room next to mine where I kept my tools and books. I didn't make an issue of it. I moved the tools to the garage. I started eating breakfast earlier so the kitchen was clear by the time she came down. I told myself this was normal. Three adults sharing a house always requires adjustment. I'd lived alone for 4 years. Maybe I'd forgotten how to accommodate other people. Then Jade got pregnant. Andrew called me down to the living room one evening in November. They were both sitting on the couch, Jade with her hands folded in her lap, Andrew looking somewhere between nervous and excited. They told me the news. I hugged my son. I told Jade I was happy for them both. And I was. A grandchild, I was happy for them both. And I was. A grandchild. Something to look forward to. But in the weeks that followed, something shifted. The conversation started. Small ones at first. Talk about the baby's room. Which of the spare bedrooms made the most sense? What they'd need to convert. I mentioned once that there was an extra room at the end of the hall that had been used for storage. Andrew said Jade wanted that one for a nursery because it got morning light. Fine. I agreed that made sense. Then one evening in January, Andrew came and knocked on my bedroom door. He stood in the doorway and didn't quite meet my eyes when he started talking. Jade's mother was going to come and stay for the first few months after the baby was born. She lived in Hamilton, they were close, it would be a big help. And the thing was, they were going to need another room. The storage room was going to be the nursery. Her mother would need somewhere to stay. And Jade had been thinking my room was the largest room on the main floor with its own bathroom, and it would be the most practical for her mother because of the stairs. I want to tell you that I said something firm right then. I want to tell you that I put my foot down in that doorway, and that was that. I didn't. I asked where I'd be sleeping. Andrew said they'd set me up in the basement. He said it quickly, like if he moved past it fast enough, I wouldn't notice what he just said. He called it a finished basement. He said he put a proper bed down there. A space heater. Maybe a TV. He said it was only temporary. He said Jade's mother wouldn't stay forever. I stood there for a moment. I scratched at my son. My son who I had taken apart appliances with, who I had driven to Toronto with his mother, who had cried at her funeral and held my hand at the graveside, and I said, "All right, let me think about it." He looked relieved. That's what I remember most. Not grateful, not apologetic. Relieved. I went back into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about Margaret for a long time. Then I called Hoffman. She remembered me immediately. When I explained the situation, there was a pause on the line, and then she said, "Victor, you own 40% of that house. Nobody can tell you where to sleep in your own home." I said I understood that, but I wanted to know what my options were if things continued to go sideways. She walked me through them, calmly, clearly, the way good professionals do. I didn't say anything to Andrew the next morning, or the morning after that. I moved my things to the basement. Not because I'd agreed, but because I wanted to see exactly what kind of household I was living in now. The basement was cool in January. There was a small window at ground level that looked out at the lawn. I set up my reading lamp and my books, and I lay in that bed the first night, and I thought, let's see how far this goes. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the temporary became permanent. Jade's mother arrived in late March. She was a quiet woman, not unkind to me, but she moved into my room as though she'd always lived there. New curtains went up. A little table appeared by the window. Jade rearranged the shared bathroom without asking. I noticed it all from the basement, and I said nothing. The baby came in April. A boy. I was in the waiting room at RBH when Andrew came through those doors, and I saw it in his face before he said a word. The stunned, overwhelmed joy of a first-time father. I stood up, and we held on to each other for a long moment, and I thought, whatever is happening in that house, this part is real. This part is mine too. But the house itself was changing around me faster than I'd expected. Jade's mother showed no signs of leaving. By June, she was talking about extending her stay until the fall. Jade had started referring to my old room as Mum's room. My tools had been moved from the garage to a corner of the basement to make room for a second car. I had stopped eating dinner with Andrew and Jade more than once or twice a week. Not because I wasn't welcome, but because the kitchen had reorganized itself around Jade's routines, and I felt like an interruption when I was there. One evening, I was in the basement reading when I heard them talking upstairs. The floor was thin in places, and if the house was quiet, you could hear conversations in the kitchen clearly. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard my name. Jade was talking about selling the house, moving somewhere larger, closer to her family in Hamilton. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she talked about most things. Andrew said something I couldn't catch. Then she said, and I heard this clearly, that the situation with me in the basement couldn't go on forever, that it wasn't fair to anyone, that at some point the arrangement would need to change. Andrew said, "What does that mean?" Jade said, "It means he'd be better off somewhere that's designed for him. There are great places. Independent living. He'd have his own space, people his own age." Andrew was quiet for a moment. I put down my book. "I'm 63 years old. I am not old. I run 3 times a week. I have a better memory than most people I've met." The idea that I would be shuffled off to a senior's residence while my ex-bedroom upstairs housed someone else's mother. I sat with that for a long time, and then I felt with the clean clarity of a decision already made that I was done waiting. The next morning I called Hoffman. I told her I wanted to move forward. She reminded me of exactly what I'd asked her to set up 2 years earlier. The 40% ownership stake was real and registered, and in the original ownership agreement, at my lawyer's suggestion, there was a clause requiring that any sale or major change to the property required consent of all registered owners. We'd framed it as standard legal protection at the time. Andrew hadn't questioned it. Hoffman explained my options. I could request a partition, a legal process where, if co-owners couldn't agree on what to do with the property, a court could order it sold and the proceeds divided according to ownership shares. I didn't want to go that route first. Instead, I wrote Andrew a letter, a formal one, on paper, because I am 63 years old and I believe in doing things properly. The letter was short. I stated that I had become aware of plans to change the living arrangement in a way that materially affected my position as a 40% owner. I stated that I did not consent to a sale of the property without fair negotiation of my interest. I noted that I had retained legal counsel, and I noted the clause in the original agreement. I left it on the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before Andrew came downstairs. I was in the basement when I heard him read it. The silence was very long. He came downstairs. He sat in the old chair I'd brought from Sudbury, and he held the letter in both hands and he looked at me the way I hadn't been looked at in a long time. Not like a problem to be managed, but like his father. "How long have you known?" he said. I said, "Since the night I heard you two talking in the kitchen." He put his head in his hands. We talked for nearly 3 hours that morning. I told him everything. The basement, the tools in the corner, the room that was now someone else's, the dinners I'd stopped being part of. I told him that I'd sold my house and moved my life here because I believed him when he said this would be a real home for all of us. I told him I wasn't angry. I was tired and I was hurt and I had missed him for months while living 30 feet away. He cried. He's not a man who cries easily. He got that from me. But he did. He said he hadn't understood what had been happening gradually. That each individual thing had seemed small and reasonable on its own. That he hadn't considered how they'd all added up. I told him I believed him. I also told him that believing him didn't undo the months in the basement. The weeks that followed were not simple. Jade's mother went home in August. Jade and I had a direct conversation. Uncomfortable, necessary, adult, where I said clearly that I would not be moved to independent living at 63 and that I expected to be treated as a co-owner of the home, not a temporary guest. She was defensive at first, then quiet. Then, to her credit, she said she understood. Andrew and I worked with Hoffman to amend the ownership agreement. My share was formally acknowledged in new documentation. We established that the main floor bedroom was mine for as long as I chose to live there. We agreed on a clear framework for household decisions. I moved back upstairs in September. The room smelled like someone else's perfume for a while. I opened the window every morning until it faded. I put Margaret's photograph back on the dresser where it belonged. I went to the Thursday woodworking group for the first time in months, and the man who ran it said, "We wondered where you'd gone." I said I'd had some things to sort out at home. My grandson is 14 months old now. He pulls himself up on the furniture and looks at me with enormous eyes, and I think he might be the most interesting person I've ever met. On Sunday mornings, I bring him down to the workshop and let him sit on the bench while I work. He watches everything with that careful focus that babies have, like the whole world is worth studying. Andrew is a good father. Whatever happened between us, and I won't pretend it didn't happen, he shows up for that boy every single day. I see the tiredness in him, and I see the love too. And I know those two things can exist in the same person at the same time because I raised him and I was both of those things once. Last month, he came into the workshop while I was there with the baby. He sat down on the old stool and watched me for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it." I kept working for a moment. Then I said, I know. Some things in a family take a long time to build back. I've been an engineer long enough to know that the rebuilding matters more than the original construction. You take what's there, you assess what's sound, and you work with what you have. You don't throw it away. I didn't throw it away, and neither did he. The thing about a basement is that it gives you a lot of time to think. I spent 3 months down there. 3 months with a space heater and a reading lamp and the low hum of a house that used to feel like mine. And I won't pretend I wasn't hurt. I was. But somewhere in those quiet evenings, I started to understand something I hadn't fully seen before. The way things fall apart is almost never one dramatic moment. It's 100 small ones. A suggestion here, a rearranged bathroom there, a dinner you stop being invited to. You look up one day and realize you've been slowly walked out of your own life, and nobody made a single decision that felt monstrous on its own. That's what happened with Andrew. He's not a bad man. I know that, but he made 100 small choices, each one easy to justify in the moment, and they added up to his father sleeping in a basement while someone else's mother slept in his room. That's what happens when we stop paying attention to the person right in front of us. When we let what's convenient override what's right. I think about what kept me steady during those months. It wasn't anger. Anger would have made me do something loud and irresistible. What kept me steady was something quieter. A sense of my own worth that I'd spent 63 years building and wasn't about to hand over because someone needed a room. That steadiness, that refusal to be rattled into bad decisions, is something I learned from my work as an engineer. You assess the structure. You identify what's sound and what isn't. You don't demolish the whole building because one wall has a crack. I also had the presence of mind 2 years earlier to sit with a lawyer before I signed anything. People ask me sometimes if I was suspicious of Jade from the start. I wasn't. I just knew that good intentions aren't a substitute for good paperwork. That's not cynicism. That's 40 years of professional life teaching you that the agreements you make clearly at the beginning save everyone enormous pain later on. It was one of the clearest-headed things I've ever done. And it cost me nothing at the time except an afternoon and a modest legal fee. Andrew and I are rebuilding. It takes longer than I'd like. There are still moments of awkwardness. Conversations that stop just short of what we both mean. But he shows up. He comes into the workshop on Sunday mornings and sits with me and his son. And sometimes we don't say much at all, and that's okay. Some things between a father and a son don't need words. What I tell anyone watching this is that your dignity is not a negotiating chip. Not with your children. Not with anyone. You can love someone completely and still hold the line. You can be the most patient, forgiving person in a room and still know your own worth well enough to pick up the phone when it matters. I didn't fight with my son. I didn't threaten him or make a scene. I just remembered who I was before any of this started. A man who built things carefully, who read the fine print, who understood that structures only hold when the foundations are sound. The foundation was always sound. I just had to remind everyone it was there.